I will admit all.
Okay, good to go. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Brooklyn. I am the webinar series manager for social marketing at Griffith. I'd like to thank you for joining us today for our introduction to behaviour change evaluation webinar. Before we begin, I would like to please ask that you keep your microphones on mute to reduce any background noise and to keep cameras off to ensure that we maintain the streaming quality throughout the session. This session is being recorded, so everyone that's registered will receive an email with the link to the video so they can watch this on demand. And I would like to now hand over to Samir and Joy, who are our presenters for today.
Thank you, Brooklyn. Welcome all. Good afternoon from Brisbane, Queensland. Thank you for joining us on our introductory session on evaluation of behavior change interventions. It's me here, Samir Deshpande, with Dr. Joy Parkinson, who will be your presenters. Before we go any further, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and pay respect to the elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So very quickly, I am the Managing Director of Social Marketing at Griffith, an academic center here in Griffith University. I will talk about the center for a couple of minutes later. Other than the normal duties of a researcher and an academic and the Managing Director, I also edit Social Marketing Quarterly, which is one of the 2 social marketing academic journals. And Joy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks, Samir. So I'm Dr. Joy Parkinson. I'm the Research Director here at Social Marketing at Griffith. So I look after the research elements of the centre, which are vast and varied, which is very exciting as well. We have quite a range of researchers that sit within our centre. I'm also part of the Australian Association of Social Marketing. I sit on the management committee, and I'm also a member of the Australian Evaluation Society as well. So I, along with Samir, take evaluation of behaviour change programs very seriously and love it to pieces. It's a really important part of the understanding what works and for who in programs and interventions. So I'll talk a little bit more about what I've been evaluating over the last few years in my part of the presentation today. So welcome, thank you.
Thank you, Joy. All right, so that's our agenda for next 1 hour. Talk about the center very quickly, then we'll get into the what and why of behavior change evaluation, how to go about constructing your evaluation activities, what are some evaluation designs that are available to researchers, and then we will focus on a particular process called the collaborative design process. We hope to have lots of interaction with you guys. Feel free to leave questions in the chat room. And once in a while, we might just pop in and see if we can answer some questions on the spot, or else we will wait till the end to have an extensive discussion. So Social Marketing Griffith is arguably the world's largest university-based behavioral change center that uses marketing principles to address social problems. Other than our typical teaching of students, grooming new scholars, conducting research, we also conduct a lot of behavior change initiatives for government, nonprofit, and corporate sector. And of course, we use research at every step of the way. We have created a model called CBE, Co-Design, Build, Engage, and Evaluation, that takes us through all these initiatives. So as you can see that the role of research is definitely key in the co-design and evaluation stage, But of course, research is used all along that behavior change process. In terms of research methods, other than the traditional self-report data methods like survey and experiments, we not only conduct first-hand observational studies, but in recent days, we have started using physiological measures like EEG and eye trackers. Other than that, as I told you, as part of our CBE process, we use co-design and creative collective solutions as one of our unique contributions to the sector, where we take along our key stakeholders right at the beginning of the process, openly discuss the differences, take their opinions very seriously, and then design and deliver solutions that are attractive to the end beneficiary and the stakeholder in such a way that the buy-in becomes easier and more readily acceptable. So just to highlight 3 of our projects that our team members, which comprises of close to 40 research and staff members, and also includes students. So one of the projects is Leave It, which has become quite a big project with the Redland City Council in the state of Queensland, near Brisbane, where our project has tried to reduce dog attacks on koalas and thus maintain the population of koalas, which is considered to be a part of the endangered species. So we have used social marketing principles to convince the dog owners to train the dogs and ensure that the conflict between dogs and koalas is minimized. Another team works on an alcohol education program with teenagers called Blurred Minds, where we have created a VR house party style intervention, including 6 online games, where the team goes from school to school and creates and educates children, teenagers 12 onwards, to convince them the importance of responsible drinking. And finally, something that we we find it very topical and important is a project that is trying to convince Queenslanders to be mindful of the amount of food waste that we create on a daily basis, because that can be an important source of climate change. So before we go any further, sorry, I was supposed to do a poll, which I seem to have forgotten. So we can please respond to this poll right now. Okay, I think everyone has responded. So we can end the poll, Brooklyn. So just to summarize, 16 of you responded. How much experience do you have with program or campaign evaluation? Almost 88% of you said none at all or some to make me dangerous. That makes us feel good that we are reaching the right audience, because our session today is very much an introductory session for those who are taking that brave step to jump into the exciting world of evaluation. Thank you. And then, since I missed out on the first poll, let us, let us jump now to the second poll. Do you want to administer that? Yeah, thanks, Brooklyn. So the question is, we plan, monitor, and evaluate because we want to know what. It's a multiple choice question. You can choose more than one option. All right, we can end the poll here since 16 of you have responded. So we had 6 options here. Let me read it out and then share the results. What is the problem and what causes it? Who are the stakeholders? What improvements can be made? What is the solution? All of the above and none of the above. So the highest response went to all of the above. 63% of you said so, which is correct. And it does make common sense that you would choose all of them, because there would be, that's how dynamic and flexible evaluation results are. However, I don't want to say that those who did not select that above option got it wrong, because, and that's the beauty of evaluation activity, which is it can be used at any one for any one or more than one purposes. So depending on your initiative, depending on what you have decided to measure, your objectives might change, and which will influence your evaluation activity. So you might say, all I care about in conducting evaluation is identifying who are the stakeholders and how have they responded to my initiative, and that is fine. So it depends on your initiative, and don't consider that any one would be more important than the other. All right. So let's jump into the very basic objectives of why we conduct plan, monitor, and behavior change intervention. And that kind of directly relates to our second poll, which is, these are some of the aspects that behavior change agents, social change managers are keenly interested in exploring. What is the problem? I think that itself is something that we can take 2 hours to explain. Why are some of the Australians, and the latest poll shows around 10 to 15% Australians who are still opposed or not certain, not sure of vaccinating against COVID-19. Where is the problem? So who is opposed to it? What profile, what demographic, what are their perceptions, what are their barriers? This could be a study in itself. And right now, as you can imagine, given the economic, physical, mental health issues, it's a very important problem to explore, understand, and given my bias of being a pro-vaccinator, I would say something that we need to address and overcome quickly. So who are the stakeholders, which is of course going beyond the audience members? Who are those other organizations and individuals who can facilitate or derail our behavior change effort? What improvements can be made if it's an existing initiative, if it's an ongoing initiative and it has stuck a roadblock or plateaued in terms of inability to bring in new stakeholders, how can we bring them in? Again, an important aspect that evaluation study can try to address. And then of course, the last 2 things are, given what we know, the barriers and the benefits sought by our stakeholders, what is the problem, what is the answer, and what are the solutions? Again, this is an ongoing process, and this is something that I will highlight maybe more than once, which is, and I like to quote Melinda Gates here, wife of Bill Gates, who runs the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who says that we in social sector tend to evaluate only once towards the end. That is not sufficient, and that is too late. Again, borrowing from the commercial sector, which is what we do in social marketing, is we need to learn, if resources are available, of course, to do our monitoring and evaluation on an ongoing basis. It cannot be kept toward the end. Evaluation is something that has to be ongoing, and you need to be real-time responsive to the new challenges that appear as the initiative develops on an ongoing basis. That is the key to success to behavior change. So what is evaluation? Before we go any further, it's good to understand that aspect. The definition is kind of listed on the slide, but if I have to summarize it, it is basically trying to see if we are achieving what we had envisioned ourselves to achieve. We had some objectives in mind, and goals in mind. Have we achieved those objectives and goals? We are in the world of behavior change. In this world, normally, our end objective is to influence the beneficiary's behavior. I want every Australian to vaccinate himself or herself when the government provides that facility in 2021. Could be a behavior change objective. The initiative evaluation activity then should go ahead and try to ask those questions. And the method could vary. Method could be multiple. It could be ongoing. It could be one time or multiple time. Whatever the case may be, the point is to then measure what you have decided to achieve. And then to achieve that behavior, of course, as we know from consumer behavior, there are many steps that precede the final adoption of behavior, which includes awareness, recognition, liking, belief, so on and so forth. Evaluation activity would also then include those aspects, which would then, theoretically speaking, link to the actual behavior adoption that we are trying to promote. So why promote? Because I mean, one of the things that's appearing the most frequently these days is that the funding agency is asking for it. Government and nonprofit and foundations are actually increasingly asking the question, for every dollar that I put in to promote an activity, how much am I getting in return? So they're becoming more metric oriented, more outcome oriented. And then the funding agencies are saying, I'm not just going to give you money to run an initiative unless you tell me whether you achieved your outcomes. So evaluation has become an integral aspect of a behavior change initiative, which, and that's a good thing, the funding agencies are willing to support. And which is why, as Joy will go on, will explain later on in her part, how an entire project has been set up where Joy is leading that project to evaluate the My Health for Life initiative in the state of Queensland. So much is the importance for evaluation that the evaluation team is actually separately contracted other than the behavior change team, just to see if it works. And of course, this is not a new story. It's not an unusual story. It's happening more often. And all large scale programs now have a dedicated evaluation team, which is good news for academics like us, because that increases our ability to contribute to the society. But other than realizing or assessing whether this initiative works, delivers on objectives and goals, another important aspect to know is what is helping achieve those behavior change initiatives, so that from a theoretical point of view, we know what are those linkages, what are the key influencers, what are those factors in the environment, within the individual, that are helping to promote the behavior, but also what can we learn so that next time we do the same initiative, we are actually more efficient and more likely to be effective. We as academics do a lot of this research within academic setting, mostly using lab research, or increasingly people like me are conducting systematic literature reviews to gather initiatives from a variety of sources, bring them together, and then provide a summary statistic of what is working. Just to give you a quick example, I have conducted a systematic literature review published in 2016 on 89 physical activity interventions from all over the world that were trying to promote physical activity among adults. And I used the social marketing benchmarks as a lens to understand what factors made a difference to successful promotion of physical activity among adults. And what we realized was aspects like formative research, having a support mechanism in terms of, let's say, a physical trainer or someone who trains people on how to be physically active, promotional activities, and providing the right benefits through the physical activity that were attractive to the audience. These factors came out to be critical, important factors that made a difference to physical activity. I would consider that to be one of the examples of how evaluation can help understand what has mattered and how going forward, we should have these factors definitely in the behavior change initiative to make it successful. So as I said, theory is important because it is an excellent mechanism to identify how various concepts, which ultimately connect to behavior, make a difference to the change in behavior before and after the intervention. Theories are dime a dozen. Some are more popular than the other. For example, Theory of Planned Behavior by Isaac Eigen, which was written in 1991, is a heavily used theory. It has its criticism. It seems to be very rational, very linear, very systematic, as opposed to how we really behave in real life. Even then, even an imperfect theory, and that's my personal opinion, gives us far more insights into what may have played a role in the interventions before us and what might play a role in what we are doing today or in the future. That imperfect theoretical insight is still better than having no theory. Do we have a perfect theory today? No. And I'll be honest with you guys. Is there one or two theories? No. As I said, the dime a dozen. It really depends on what you're trying to achieve, what aspects are important to you. If your intervention is talking to teenagers, many times the normative influence, peer influence becomes critical. In that sense, normative theories like social norms theory becomes relevant. So one has to pick the right theory, or at least appropriate theory that will make conceptual sense to the intervention you're trying to achieve, trying to deliver. The audience that you're trying to speak. Those factors do make a difference to the selection of theory. I would always say have some theory that guides your understanding of the audience, that helps you design the intervention, and eventually that helps you to evaluate that intervention. That consistency of theoretical underpinning or foundation makes a big difference to creating an intervention and evaluating it, which is far superior than you would otherwise have. An important point that gets asked is, what is the value of evaluation? And the answer is, it depends. Are you surprised by an academic giving you that answer? The value depends on who you are and what you want to achieve. Value differs on the stakeholder. So if I may jump to the next slide and then come back to this one, it depends on who you are. If you are a policymaker, you are interested in the financial ROI. Is my every dollar that I put in going to make a difference to the society? When I was in Canada, where I stayed for 13 years, I was part of a physical activity intervention initiative at the national level called Participaction, which was funded by the government of Canada. So as a research team advisor to that national intervention, one of the questions that was asked to us by the Minister of Health was, all this money that I have put in, or my department has put in for the last 30 years, can you tell me in a minute what is the return on investment? And as academics, we didn't have an answer. So we spent another year, and some of us, not me, brought in health economists to measure the input and output ratio to see what made a difference. So that is one kind of questions that ministers are interested in. And of course, as politicians, they're interested in shorter time frames, something that will give them visibility and in the media, and of course, some quick returns. So on and so forth. So depending on the stakeholder, your objectives are going to change, and that is going to influence what you are going to measure in an evaluation. So it is important that as a behavior change agent, even for the evaluation activity, not just for the intervention, but even for the evaluation activity, you keep in mind the key stakeholders who are going to make a difference to your intervention. And other than how should the behavior change creative and strategy should be, you should also consider them while designing your evaluation activity. And that is important because that will decide the framing of the questions, which is what I discussed in the previous slide, influence the key indicators, dictates whom you are evaluating, beneficiary, but other stakeholders as well, and then what you are going to measure, right? When you address the stakeholders' requirements, funding for evaluation also becomes easier and more readily available because they want to know if it makes sense. As a result, our minister in Canada was willing to put in money to hire research assistants to identify the SROI. So before we get into constructing of evaluation, where Joy takes over, let us now administer our third poll. Brooklyn? What should the evaluation plan include? Should it be evaluation of inputs, activities, and outcomes, or should it be evaluation of only outcomes? All right, we have 18 responses here. It's unanimous that all of you said evaluation of inputs, activities, and outcomes. And Joy, you can jump in here and take over from here to explain how you want to interpret these results.
Thank you, Samir. Well, that's well done, everybody. Yes, of course, we do want to look at our activities and our outcomes and inputs as well, rather than just our outcomes. So, of course, as Samir talked about at the very start of his presentation, that we actually want to do ongoing evaluations rather than just looking at what happens at the end. So we don't just want to look at the outcomes, we want to look at what are the activities and what are the inputs and what happens along the way in an evaluation. So of course, an ongoing evaluation is the gold standard. Samir, would you like to just change my slide, please? Thank you. And of course, this is always dependent on our resources as well. Sometimes we only have enough funds to actually look at what happens at the end, but at a very minimum, we would want to take some baseline data and then the data from the end as well, so that we can understand what actually happened in our program. So a good evaluation helps us to understand what works for who and in which context. And as Samir talked about before, it's really good to undertake evaluations and increasingly, funders are looking for good evaluations as well, because it allows us to understand what worked and what didn't work, and we can share that understanding as well. So that can be used to inform future interventions and programs to make them more successful, so that we can avoid some of the pitfalls, but also do some of those things that are really successful. So Samir's presented to you some of the underpinnings of evaluation and the why we would want to be doing evaluation. And I'm going to now take you through some of the application of evaluation. So as Samir talked about before, I lead a rather large evaluation, which I will talk about in a little moment, and we're independent evaluators, and increasingly that's what funders are looking for as well, so that the results can be communicated with some confidence that they haven't been biased by the people who are actually running the program or the intervention. So we start by looking at our planning and how we map our planning onto the evaluation. So all programs need to be designed, and as Samir talked about before, in social marketing at Griffith, we use the CBE model, so co-design, build, and then evaluate. So as we're actually planning our program, we of course start off by setting some goals, and then we drill down a little bit further to set some specific objectives that we want to achieve and measure, and then we develop our strategies and actions to achieve those goals. And then if you look down, you can see the evaluation activities that we undertake to achieve each of these. So we look at the activities. So we have map out our activities that we're going to evaluate. We look at our short-term and our medium-term outcomes. So what's going to happen while people participate in the program, and then potentially what happens in that time period after they finish or complete the program. And then what are the long-term outcomes or impacts? So they're our overall goals. So if our overall goal is to reduce chronic disease, for example, this is where we measure that, looking at the long-term outcomes. Do we reduce the incidence of chronic disease in a certain population, for example? Thanks, Samir. So as part of that planning process, there's a range of tools that we can use, but a really popular one is to use a program logic or a theory of change. So what this allows us to do is actually develop our problem statement. So actually understanding what's the underlying issue that we're actually trying to address, who's being affected by it. So understanding who are we actually targeting, and then what are the root causes of the issue as well. So we want to develop our problem statement to be really specific, and not, to give us an understanding of what the program is and what it's trying to achieve, rather than just stating that we need the program. Then we start to map the inputs. So what are the resources that we have? So we need to think about not just our financial resources, but all of those other resources. So the human or people resources, networks, community groups, all of those other people that might, or stakeholders that might have an input. And stakeholders are really important to consider in an evaluation as well. Then we have our outputs or our activities, looking at what are we actually doing with within the program. And this is part of that process evaluation. So we often talk about a monitoring and evaluation framework. So these form part of that monitoring part. What will have been done when you finish delivering the program? So these are the types of questions that we're looking at. So being careful not to confuse our outputs, so what is delivered, with our outcomes, which is what changes have actually happened as a result of the program. And then we have our participation outputs as well. So who is the target group for our program? What are the demographics? Who else is involved? What's their role? Those types of things. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, some different frameworks that actually help us to put this into practice as well. Then we have our outcomes, so our short, our medium and long-term outcomes. So what's actually going to be different if people undertake the activities from our program? And they would be usually what we expect to see at the end of the program. So that might be a change in fruit and vegetable consumption, for example, or it might be a change in awareness or a change in intention to eat fruit and vegetables. Then we start to look at our medium-term outcomes. So what changes will happen as a result of your program? So sometimes these changes actually take a little bit of time for us to be able to see, because people need to practice new behaviours, for example. And then our long-term outcomes, so they're our impact. So, this is what we are looking for when we actually first start developing that problem statement. So what is it we're actually trying to change? And are we trying to reduce the incidence of smoking? Are we trying to increase physical activity in young people or older adults, for example? And did that actually happen? Thanks, Samir. So I'm just going to take you through some of the broad steps to evaluation. And of course, today we're just giving you quite a brief overview of evaluation. Of course, evaluation activities are quite in-depth. So we're just giving you a bit of a taster today. So we want to describe the program in detail, its objectives and how its components lead to its intended outcomes. So that's using that program logic that we've just discussed. Formulate our evaluation question. So what is it we're actually trying to find out? What is the evaluation trying to achieve? Deciding on the measures or methods that will be able to provide the data that we need to actually answer those evaluation questions, and then deciding how to collect that data and putting into place the procedures that will allow the data to be collected. And as Samir said before, we want to do ongoing evaluations. So we want to do those monitoring and evaluation activities. So we need to make sure that we've got the metrics in place across time to allow us to collect that data. So that might be having observations at particular time points through the program delivery, or it might be having surveys to understand, attitudes, behaviours, self-confidence, all those types of things, motivations that we've talked about before. And then we need to collect and analyse the data. So no point just having all of that data there. We actually need to analyse it and then interpret it and act on those findings as well. And as part of the evaluation that I lead, we use those findings to actually feed back into the program so that there's a continual improvement of the program. So using the findings, we make recommendations, and then the program actually implements those findings and recommendations into the program to make improvements through many innovations. Thank you. So in our steps, we first want to develop our outcomes hierarchy. So using a backcasting approach, which I'll show you in a moment. Identify the deliverables. So what are we actually needing? What are our milestones? What are we trying to actually deliver as part of the program? And then identifying our assumptions. So, understanding what we know now, and then also what we want, and thinking about those external factors. So the things that we may not necessarily be able to control. Thank you. So looking at backcasting, there's 5 steps in backcasting. So first of all, we want to list all the possible outcomes for our project. And then we want to cluster or group those outcomes. And then we can rearrange them into an if-then logic chain so that we can understand, if this happens, then this will be the outcome. Or if that happens, then this might be the outcome. Identify the feedback loops, which is what I talked about before. Where can we get information from and how can we use that? And then validate this process with our key stakeholders. And stakeholders are really important to involve right across the process. And I'll show you that in my example of how you can do that as well. Thank you. So when we're talking about stakeholders, we need to list all of our stakeholders. And sometimes we need to think a little bit outside of the box for who the stakeholders might actually be. So very simplistically or broadly, we might have our program clients or the participants in the program, our partner agencies, could be our program staff and management. But you can see here from our diagram that there's a lot of other people or stakeholders that can actually be involved or need to be consulted with when we're developing a program, and particularly an evaluation. So it can be a range of NGOs, for example, or research partners, or suppliers, or investors, or local media. There's many different stakeholders that we can actually consider. Thank you. So when it comes to identifying the deliverables, we need to think about our outputs. What do we actually need to produce? Do we need to produce manuals or other resources? Or what are the goods, or what are the services that we actually need to provide as part of our program? So we need to document all of those and think again really broadly. And again, this is really useful to do some brainstorming activities and workshopping these output ideas. And then our activities. So what are the actions that we need to produce our program output? So what do we actually need to achieve what we're going to do in our program? Next, thank you. Thinking about assumptions, we need to do this really carefully, and sometimes we need to take a little step back to think about, what are our beliefs about the program, how it will work, and then thinking about that perspective from program participants. And that's where, our CBE model is really good. So we co-design with our participants. So it's always using that human-centered approach and putting people at the center of everything that we do, not basing things on our own assumptions, because quite often we get that wrong. So we need to understand things like, how do they learn? How do they behave? What media do they actually consume? How do they interact with the media? What are their motivations? What do they think? What's important to them? And sometimes what we think is important to them, or what should be important to them, is not actually what's important to them. For example, if we're thinking about developing a health behaviour change program, of course we think that everybody should view health as being really important. But for many people, that's not their reality. For them, being happy might be more important, or putting food on the table for their children might be more important, or getting to enjoy their children or grandchildren or their family and friends and having a good time, or playing sport might be more important. So whilst they understand being healthy is important, it's not the most important thing to them. So we need to, sometimes step back from our own assumptions and step into the shoes of our participants to really understand that. And we need to document those assumptions as well. And they also help us to overcome some of those unintended consequences of a program, where the best laid plans and, the best developed project or program, may go terribly wrong because we haven't thought through something from our participants' perspective. So moving into evaluation design. So there are a vast array of evaluation designs, and it really depends on your program and what your evaluation questions are. What are your goals? What are you trying to achieve in your program? So it's going to be also defined by your resources, the time, the money, the staff, the skills that you have available. For some projects, the My Health for Life project I've been evaluating has been very well funded. So we're able to do almost everything that we would want to do in an evaluation. But sometimes we have very limited money. And so that limits our access to staff and data collection and even data analysis. So we need to consider all of these things. Of course, the stronger the design, the more confidence you can have in the findings. And I'm going to talk you through the hierarchy of design in a moment. There are a lot of methods that you can choose from that, of course, vary in their scientific rigor and particularly how they affect your capacity, so that any effects can be attributed to the program or intervention. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment when we talk about things such as randomized control trials, where we do actually have a control group allow us to actually talk about the effects being attributed to the program. But when we're looking at, a behaviour change program that happens in a community, for example, often it's not ethical to actually have a control group. We can't leave anybody out. So all we can say is that the program may have contributed to impacts or behaviour change, but we should be able to do that if we've measured across time as well. So, and do that with some confidence. So as I said before, we really want to do that pre and post at a very minimum. And, how can we actually improve on that? So we can collect data from different locations, for example, or from different time points. And also by collecting data from a range of groups, and that could be different geographic groups, for example, or over extended periods of time, we can have more confidence in our data and it becomes stronger. And then, of course, by adding a comparison group is really helpful. Sometimes it might not be a control group, but we can perhaps compare between two different communities. We might want to compare between a regional community and a metropolitan community, for example, to see how it works differently, or two matched communities. So they might be two metropolitan communities or two regional communities, and we can compare the differences to see if they have the same change or if there's something different. And, perhaps we might need to look further into the environment to explain some of those differences. And as I said before, using a randomized control trial is the true gold standard, but not very realistic. And adding that control group really does allow us to make comparisons to actually understand the effects and whether they can be attributed to the program or not. Thank you. So there's a range of different frameworks that we can use, and multi-level interventions that incorporate policy, environmental and individual components using socio-ecological type approaches should be evaluated with measurements suited to their settings, goals and purpose. So we can see here, and this is using the RE-AIM framework, that we can look at reach and efficacy, for example, which is looking at the individual level, then looking at adoption and implementation, which is at the organisation level, and then maintenance, so the extent to which a program is sustained over time. So we need to look at both the individual and organisational level. So can people maintain their behaviour over time? Can they continue to participate in the program? And can the organisation continue to run the program over time? Does it self-fund? Those types of things. Thanks. So here's some example questions from a RE-AIM framework, which is a really useful public health framework that allows us to look at reach, effectiveness, adoption, implementation, and maintenance. Now, whilst REAIM is a great acronym, it's actually not quite in the correct order of how we look at the activities. But if we just look at REACH, some of the questions, the evaluation questions we can answer is, to what extent did the program reach the target group? How successful were the program engagement activities at reaching the target group and the appropriate stakeholders? And what were the key motivators and barriers to program engagement at the participant level? And then if we look at adoption, how many and which organisations supported the program implementation? And do stakeholders value the program? What do they think of the program? Is it something that they want to continue using? And then looking at implementation, which is, of course, really important. And that's part where we would look at the monitoring of the program. Were participants satisfied with the program experience? Which delivery modes would have enhanced their success or satisfaction or participation in the program? And was the program reflexive in making changes to enhance success, satisfaction, participation in the program? So, of course, that links back to what we talked about earlier with feedback loops and that continual improvement model. So were innovative solutions developed in response to ongoing evaluation of the program? So this framework allows us to get a really holistic picture of the program. So not just looking, did people change their fruit and vegetable consumption, but really understanding the program and its implementation and the success of the program from a range of, or through a range of dimensions. Thank you. Then, of course, there's other frameworks that we can use, and it really does depend on your resources. So here we have the CDC evaluation framework that's used for public health, and that's, you know, comes out of the US CDC. And they actually have a range of resources that you can access for free to undertake evaluation. So you can see that they take a similar approach. So, you know, describing the program, focusing on your evaluation design, gathering your evidence, justifying your conclusions, ensuring that you use and share the lessons. So that's really important, as I mentioned before, and also engaging stakeholders. So thinking about the standards, so the utility, the feasibility, the proprietary, and the accuracy. So, yeah, a range of different viewpoints that we can actually use. Thanks, Mia. And it's time for our fourth poll, thinking about the collaborative design process. So what methods or method is or are appropriate for conducting monitoring and evaluation activities? Excellent. Yes, using both quantitative and qualitative studies is really important. Well done. Everybody has answered that correctly. So it is really important to use a range of data collection techniques and metrics to give us a really thorough understanding. So as you know, looking back at that REAIM framework and all of those questions, many of those questions can't be answered using just one method. We really do need a mixed method approach. So now I'm going to just take you through a quick example as we quickly run out of time. Samir and I both love evaluation, so we really can spend all day talking about it. My Health for Life is a rather large Queensland government funded program. It's currently funded by Health and Wellbeing Queensland, originally funded by Queensland Health. Originally, it aimed to complete 10,000 participants or Queensland residents aged 45 plus who are at risk of developing a range of chronic diseases, and to do 200,000 risk assessments. Those goals were reached in April last year, and it's currently completed about 11,500 participants and changed their behaviour as well. So it's a program that runs a group-based program or a telephone health coach program or a workplace program. And during, of course, COVID, some of those group-based programs shifted to video conferencing. And many of them, or most of them, have now gone back to face-to-face. So it's really developed around support. It uses the health action process approach theory to underpin it. Samir talked about theories earlier and how we use them to underpin program design. It also underpins our evaluation as well, because it takes us through the motivational and then volitional stage of behaviour change. So the collaborative design process, which of course builds on our CBE model or expands that out a little bit. So it uses advisory group or consulting groups of experts to develop the program. It's based on a literature review of evidence, as Samir talked about before, undertaking systematic literature reviews, consumer research with the target groups to really, help us to understand their perspective. So that's where it helps us to overcome some of those assumptions. Co-design sessions, so actually co-creating the program with the participants and then concept proofing that to test it out. Developing culturally appropriate resources as well. So you can see Leonie here, who has pulled together a range of resources. So you don't always have to develop new resources. She's pulled together a range of resources that are also used for First Peoples to complement the specifically developed My Health for Life resources. And then refinement of the program and rollout. And of course, an ongoing evaluation. So that evaluation commenced 4 years ago and continues now. And also ongoing research with the participants. So actually conducting like market research to understand whether the engagement activities are working, what they think about the program and its resources, and how they interact with the program. And then that continual innovation and improvement. Thank you. So it's a really complex program with a range of different stakeholders as well. There's the program is run by an alliance, which includes, it's headed up by Diabetes Queensland, includes Heart Foundation, Stroke Foundation, the Queensland PHNs, Queensland Aboriginal and Islander Health Council, and the Ethnic Communities Council of Queensland as well, plus a range of, allied health services as well, who actually deliver the program. Thank you. So these are some of the older findings, and I'm just giving you a broad overview to show you the types of things that an evaluation can actually help you to understand. So we can understand what the policy, practice and public health impact is of a program through the outcomes and the impacts, but we can understand the program growth, for example, and understand that reach and how many people are participating in the program across time, and what the different activities, so for example, the engagement and the marketing activities do to that growth, and how they can filter people into the pipeline for the program, whether the program is achieving its objectives or not, and then understanding things like community awareness. And you'll see that that's in red there. At the time of this report, because the program hadn't been allowed to undertake any mass media activities, there was low awareness in the community of the program. But unsurprisingly, when they started doing their television advertising, that community awareness increased really, really quickly. It also allows the program to have an evidence-based and data-driven decision-making. So every decision that they make, every new innovation that they implement into the program is based on evidence and based on data, so that they can be really confident that what they're doing is actually backed up by data and evidence. And that's a key part of an evaluation. And then developing the specific collateral to optimise the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and the culturally and linguistically diverse engagement and participation really came out of some of those earlier evaluation activities. Thanks, Samir. And just to give you a bit of a broad overview of some of the success outcome or successful outcomes of the program. So this was on 3,000 participants in that first year that the program was rolled out. So they decreased their BMI, they lost weight, and they also decreased their waist circumference, which was really exciting. They increased their fruit and vegetable consumption as well, increased their physical activity, which has been maintained over time as well, which is really important. And one of my favourite outcomes of the program is that people's mentally unhealthy days decreased after participating in the program. And some of the qualitative feedback was around the support that the program actually provides to people and makes them feel better about themselves because they're being socially connected. So whilst the program has content around physical activity, diet, reducing sugar sweetened beverages and takeaway consumption, decreasing your tobacco consumption, those types of things. It's the social connection which is a really important part of the program. And that's why it's really important to have a theory that underpins the program so that you can then actually measure all of the elements that you're trying to change in the program. So hopefully that's just given you a little brief overview of how you can develop an evaluation and then the types of outcomes that you can see as a result of that evaluation activity. So question and answer time.
So very quickly, thanks Joy very much for sharing your insights. Before we get into questions, just wanted to say that if we are offering a extended session of evaluation on 26th March. There is a fee attached to that. And we hope during that session to go deeper into the evaluation topics, like the learning outcomes listed on the slide, and would like to have some hands-on activities which are tailored to your specific situation, although we are happy to create our own situation to take all of you guys through that process. So yeah, I thought I will have that information in front of you guys so that you know there are more opportunities available to learn more about evaluation. Okay, I'll stop sharing my slide set and get into Q&A. So if you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the chat room. I just wanted to add one more point to Joy's discussion, which was at the end of the day, whichever method you choose, with whatever indicators you measure, if we have not learned sufficiently about the persons whom we are trying to influence, and if we have not learned deeper insights about the problem and the solution, I would say we have not done a good job successfully evaluating our initiative. So that's one of the benchmarks, so to speak, a qualitative benchmark for the team. Am I better prepared today as a result of my evaluation activity than I was before the activity? And I think that's something to bear in mind. And just one quick point, which is we need to be honest, reporting what we find. Because many times I find, and I'll be blunt here, a dishonesty in what were the objectives. If we evaluate it, we don't get